rancher, lived alone for years until he found a hungry young Bigfoot lost in the woods. In the far woods of Oregon, a man who had stopped talking to the world heard a cry that no man should ever hear. Not a scream, a child's cry echoing through the fog. And when he found the tracks, he knew this was no human. It was hungry lost and scared. So he did the only thing his heart remembered. He offered food and warmth and silence. What came next wasn't fear. It was trust. And in that quiet place between man and monster, a friendship was born that would change both forever. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. In the deep forests of Oregon, the year was 1908. Autumn had come early, sharp winds whispered through the pines, and the world felt older, quieter, lonelier. Walter Hensley, 58, lived alone in a small cabin beneath the mountain ridge. He'd built it with his own hands, plank by plank, after leaving the noise of men behind. Now only the wind and the flicker of a lantern kept him company. That night, as the fire dimmed low and the rain began to fall, he heard a sound that froze him where he sat. Not a wolf, not a coyote, a cry. Soft, trembling, like a child's voice lost between the trees. Walter stepped outside, lantern trembling in his grip. "Hello," he called. No answer, only that small, aching sound drifting through the dark. He waited, listening. The forest gave nothing back, but deep down something stirred inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Pity, fear, and a strange old ache that whispered not again. Each night after the cry returned, always at the same hour, always from the same patch of trees. And every time he heard it, Walter felt the same shiver in his chest, as if the forest itself was calling out to his loneliness. He looked toward the darkness, the light trembling across his weathered face, and said softly, "No one should cry like that. Not out here." Part 1. The Man Who Stopped Talking. Morning came softly over the Oregon hills, the mist rolling off the pines like a slow breath from the earth itself. Inside the small wooden cabin at the foot of the ridge, the world was quiet. The kind of silence that lingers not because there's peace, but because there's no one left to speak. Walter Hensley stirred the ashes in his old stove, coaxing a faint flame to life. The fire crackled, throwing orange light across walls scarred with time. His limp made every step sound heavy against the wooden floorboards. He wasn't old, not yet, but the years had carved deep lines into his face, and the solitude had turned his voice into something brittle, rarely used. On the table beside him sat a framed photograph covered in a thin layer of dust. He reached out, brushed it clean with calloused fingers. The picture was faded, but her smile was still there. Anna, his wife, the only person who ever filled this cabin with laughter. She'd been gone 10 years now, lost to a storm so fierce it had buried their world in white before he could reach her. Walter still remembered the scream of the wind that night, the way her hand slipped from his in the blinding snow. Since then, he hadn't left the mountains for long. Didn't see the point. He spoke to the fire sometimes as if it could listen. He spoke to Rex, the old dog with a gray muzzle who never strayed far from the hearth. And when he said nothing at all, the forest spoke for him, the whisper of trees, the creak of the roof, the sigh of wind through the chimney. He didn't mind the quiet. But lately something inside that quiet had begun to stir again. The night before, the cry he'd heard out in the woods hadn't left his thoughts. It had followed him into his dreams, soft and broken like a child begging the darkness to listen. Walter poured himself coffee, black lukewarm, and sat down beside the window. Beyond the frost-covered glass, the forest stretched endlessly, a kingdom of cold light and shadow. He stared at it for a long while, his breath fogging the pain until his reflection disappeared, and all he saw was the vastness beyond. Rex barked once low and short, sensing his master's unease. Walter reached down, scratching the dog's neck absently. "It's all right, boy," he murmured. "Just the wind." But he knew it wasn't the wind. That sound, that cry, had come from something alive. and that thought strangely didn't scare him as much as it should have. He rose, walking slowly across the room, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. He picked up a wool coat from the peg and paused in front of the photograph again. Her smile stared back soft and knowing. For years he'd told himself that helping anyone or anything was a fool's errand. The world takes what it wants, he used to say. But staring at Anna's face, now that old ache came back, the one he tried to bury under years of silence. He whispered under his breath, voice cracked and thin, "I couldn't save you then. Maybe I can now." Rex tilted his head at the sound of his master's voice, the first words spoken aloud in days. Walter slipped on his coat, stepped out into the cold. The morning air bit at his skin, sharp and clean. The forest loomed ahead, silent except for the drip of melted frost. He followed the faint path that led to the creek, where he'd found the strange footprints the day before. The prints were still there, half filled with ice now, but unmistakable. Too big for a child. Too narrow for a bear. He crouched down, tracing the outline with his glove. Something about it tugged at him, not fear, but recognition, like the echo of a promise. The cry had sounded young, lost, hungry. And the longer he stared at those prints, the more he saw something human in them. He looked back toward the cabin, where smoke curled gently from the chimney. He could pretend he hadn't heard anything, could go back to the warmth and the quiet and the years that had already swallowed most of his life. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, from something older. The memory of helplessness. The sound of the storm 10 years ago. The weight of a promise he never got to keep. He stood there for a long time before saying to no one in particular, "If there's something out there, it doesn't deserve to die alone." Rex barked softly as if agreeing. Walter straightened his breath, rising in white clouds. He didn't know what he was going to do or what waited for him beyond those trees. But for the first time in a decade, he felt something break through the numbness, a faint trembling purpose. The wind rose through the pines, carrying the faintest echo of that same cry, distant but real. Walter turned toward it, lantern in hand, eyes narrow and resolute. For 10 long years he had lived without reason to speak. Now the forest had given him one. Part 2, the first offering. The sun fell early that evening, sinking behind the ridge and leaving the forest awash in dim amber light. A fine mist hung in the air, turning every branch into a shadow and every gust of wind into a whisper. Walter Hensley stood at the edge of his clearing coat collar, pulled high against the cold drizzle. He held a small tin plate in one hand, half a biscuit, and a slice of smoked venison. Simple food, but it was all he had to spare. He hesitated, glancing toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond those dark trunks that sound the cry had come from night after night. It had stopped him from sleeping, but not because he feared it. No, it was because it hurt to hear. He crouched near a fallen cedar stump, set the food down carefully, and stepped back. "If you're out there," he muttered, voice barely above a breath, "this is for you." The forest didn't answer. Only the faint patter of rain filled the air. He stood a moment longer, then turned back toward the cabin, Rex following at his heel. The dog glanced behind them once, uneasy, as if expecting movement. But there was nothing, only the endless stillness of the woods. That night, Walter didn't hear the cry. For the first time in a week, silence held. When dawn came, he stepped outside, unsure what he'd find. The air was sharp and clean. Mist curled along the ground like smoke. He walked to the stump slowly, heart thudding harder than it should. The plate was empty. Clean empty. Not torn apart, not scattered. And in its place, 2 small branches laid neatly in an X. Walter froze. His breath caught halfway out of his chest. He knelt, staring at the crossed sticks. They weren't random. The lines were too straight, the placement too precise. He whispered, almost afraid to break the moment. "You understood." Rex sniffed at the stump, ears twitching. The forest around them seemed to be listening too. That day Walter felt something shift. For years the woods had been his solitude, something to survive inside, not connect with. But now it felt alive again, as if it had eyes watching, waiting. That evening he brought more food. A handful of berries, a small piece of bread. He set them on the same stump, nodded once toward the trees, and went inside. It became a rhythm. Every night he'd leave something. Every morning it would vanish, replaced by small, quiet offerings, a feather, a pine cone, stones stacked into tiny towers. The exchanges were wordless, but heavy with meaning. Each time Walter found himself waiting by the window, longer before bed, watching the darkness just beyond the lantern's reach. He didn't know why he was doing it anymore. Maybe because it gave him something to wake up for. Maybe because he felt less alone. A week passed. Then 2. The forest had stopped being silent. It breathed again. The birds returned. The creek sang louder. Even the air seemed softer. But one night something changed. The rain had come again, steady and cold. Walter sat near the fire, reading from his worn Bible, when Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked. The old dog's fur bristled. Then came the sound. Not the cry, not the whimper. Something deeper, a voice. From the trees, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind between the raindrops. Food. Safe. Friend. The words were broken rough like a growl trying to learn language. Walter froze. The Bible slipped from his hand, landing open on the floor. His breath caught. He turned toward the door, the world narrowing to that one sound. Rex whined softly, pressing close to his leg. The voice came again, clearer this time, the syllables dragging heavy through the night. Food, safe, friend. 3 words. Simple. Human. Walter stood motionless, the glow of the fire painting his face in trembling orange light. His mind tried to explain it. Echoes, tricks of the storm, anything but what it truly was. But deep down he knew. Whatever lived out there had understood him, had accepted the offering, had spoken back. He stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, the rain misting his face. The trees stood dark and endless ahead. "Who are you?" he called softly. His voice cracked rough from disuse. No answer, only the sigh of wind through the pines. But as he turned to go back inside, he saw it, a faint shape between the trunks, low to the ground, eyes reflecting the lamplight for a split second before vanishing. Small, watching, not hunting. Walter's pulse thundered in his ears, but his fear was gone. In its place, something gentler bloomed, recognition, gratitude, awe. He whispered into the dark, "It's all right. I know you're out there." Then he lowered the lantern, stepped back inside, and closed the door. Behind him, the rain eased. And for the first time in a decade, Walter Hensley went to sleep with a faint smile on his face. Part 3. The Child in the Fog. The forest was wrapped in fog that morning, a soft, milky veil that blurred the edges of the world. Every sound was muted, swallowed by the mist. Even the creek, usually loud and playful, murmured quietly under the blanket of cold air. Walter Hensley walked slow, careful not to slip on the damp stones. His breath came out in short clouds. Rex padded beside him, nose twitching at scents, invisible to the human eye. The light was thin, pale gold, dripping through the cedar branches. Everything glistened, every leaf, every web, every blade of grass, as if the forest had been remade in glass overnight. Walter carried a small bundle in his hand, a piece of bread, a strip of dried rabbit, and a few berries. He had been leaving food for weeks now, and each time it vanished. Each morning something small and deliberate was left behind in return. Sticks, arranged stones, stacked a pattern of thanks he couldn't quite decipher. But today felt different. There was a stillness in the air, heavy with watching. Rex froze first, the dog's ears perked, tail stiff. Walter followed his gaze toward the creek, where fog drifted low over the water. At first he saw nothing, just shapes of trees melting into one another. Then, movement. A small figure crouched near the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a cedar trunk. The shape was wrong for a man, too short, too broad through the shoulders. The fur covering it glistened with moisture, dark and matted. Walter's heart slammed against his ribs. It was real. Not a story, not a trick of the eye. The creature, no taller than a child of 10, was trembling. Its arms hung long and thin fingers curled into the mud. The fur around its neck was patchy, as if worn thin from hunger or sickness. It turned its head slightly, and for the first time he saw its eyes. They weren't wild like an animal's. They were deep, dark, and searching. Afraid, yes, but aware. Walter didn't move. He knew the wrong sound, the wrong breath could send it fleeing back into the trees forever. He knelt slowly, letting the damp earth soak into his knees. He placed the bundle of food on a flat stone, careful and deliberate, like setting an offering on an altar. Then he whispered, almost afraid to hear his own voice. "It's all right. You can eat." The creature's head tilted, curious, unsure. A low, uneasy sound came from its throat, half a growl, half a whimper. Walter lifted his hand palm outward, the old wordless gesture of peace. Rex stood still, as if sensing this moment wasn't meant for barking. The two beings, man and beast, stayed locked in stillness, watching one another across the small distance of the clearing. The fog curled between them like slow-moving smoke. Walter could hear his own heartbeat. The world seemed to narrow to those two eyes, the eyes of something born of the wild, yet capable of fear and trust. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Then cautiously the creature moved. Step by step it crept toward the stone. Its movements were fluid but wary, like a deer approaching a river it doesn't trust. The air trembled around them, fragile as glass. When it reached the food, it hesitated. One long arm reached out, trembling. Its hand, yes, a hand, took the strip of rabbit meat, holding it close to its chest. The other hand hovered ready to bolt if the man made a move. But Walter didn't. He stayed perfectly still, watching in quiet awe. The creature sniffed the food once, then ate quickly, its small jaw working in silence. When it finished, it looked back up at him, and for a fleeting instant their eyes met again. This time there was no fear in the creature's gaze, only a strange, silent question. Walter felt something in his chest twist, that same ache he had felt when he'd lost Anna, when he'd failed to save her. Only now it wasn't regret. It was something softer. Hope, maybe. He whispered again, voice breaking with emotion. "You're safe here." The creature blinked once, then turned. It moved back into the fog, silent, graceful, vanishing, as if the forest itself had swallowed it whole. Walter stayed kneeling long after it was gone. The morning sun finally broke through the mist, spilling pale gold across the clearing. The only sound left was the steady trickle of the creek. He felt Rex press against his leg, warm and solid. The old dog whined softly, sensing his master's unease. Walter smiled faintly, rubbing the dog's ear. "We're not alone anymore, boy." As he stood to leave, he noticed something near the stone, a single pine cone placed upright, balanced perfectly. A gift. The smallest proof that this morning had not been a dream. He picked it up gently, holding it in his palm. The forest felt different now, not empty, but alive with unseen presence. For the first time in years, Walter felt a quiet warmth rise through his chest. Not joy, exactly, something deeper, something old. The kind of peace that comes when two lonely souls finally find each other in the silence. He whispered one last time into the mist, "Thank you," then turned back toward the cabin. His footsteps slow, steady, and lighter than they'd been in a decade. Part 4. The Fire and the Cold. The first snow came early that year. By mid-November, the forest had turned ghostly white. Frost clung to every branch, every roof beam of Walter's small cabin. The creek was frozen at the edges, its song buried beneath sheets of ice. Walter worked slower these days, his legs stiff from the cold, his breath fogging thick in the air. He stacked wood beside the door, listening to the quiet thrum of winter settling in. For weeks now he hadn't seen the young creature again. He still left food on the stump every morning, bits of stew bread, crust dried meat. Some days it disappeared. Others it stayed until morning frost covered it like a small grave. He told himself it had moved on, maybe found its way home. But something in him refused to believe that. Then one evening, as the snow fell in soft white spirals, Rex began to growl. Walter looked up from the fire. "What is it, boy?" The dog's eyes were fixed on the door, hackles raised but not barking. Just that low, trembling growl the sound dogs make when they're afraid but don't want to show it. Walter stood, grabbed his lantern, and opened the door. The wind rushed in, biting cold and sharp. Beyond the porch, the world was silver with snow, and there, barely visible beneath a fir tree, was a small, dark shape. It moved weakly, half buried in the drift. Walter's chest tightened. He stepped out into the cold, crunching through the snow until he reached it. The creature lay curled on its side, fur-soaked body shivering. Its breathing was shallow, faint. One hand was clutching its chest as if trying to hold warmth inside. Walter knelt beside it, his heart pounding. "Hey, hey, easy now," he whispered. His breath came out in white clouds. "You came back." The creature's eyes fluttered open, glazed, unfocused. It tried to move, but couldn't. Walter didn't hesitate. He slid his arms beneath the trembling body. It was lighter than he remembered, too light. Bones under fur, cold as stone. He carried it back toward the cabin, the snow crunching under his boots, every step slower than the last. Rex whined and followed, sniffing anxiously at the creature's dangling hand. Inside, Walter laid it beside the fire. He fetched an old wool blanket, draped it over the thin frame, and stirred the embers until flames rose high again. The warmth spread quickly through the room, flickering gold on the creature's face. Its chest moved faster now, breath-deepening body relaxing under the blanket. Walter poured a bit of warm water into a tin cup, held it near the creature's lips. "Come on, drink." "Just a little." It obeyed, weakly sipping, then sank back with a soft sigh. Walter sat down beside it, exhaustion and relief washing over him all at once. The sound of the storm outside was steady now, the voice of winter whispering through the cracks. Rex lay curled near the fire, eyes half open, still watchful. Walter stared at the creature, this strange, fragile thing that the world called a monster. Up close, it looked almost human in its helplessness. The fur around its neck was thin. Its small hands clutched the blanket like a child would. He remembered another winter long ago, the one that had taken Anna. The cold that had crept into her skin, no matter how much wood he burned, no matter how tightly he held her. He leaned back, voice low, trembling. "I couldn't save her, but I can save you." The words hung in the air like a prayer. As the night went on, Walter kept the fire alive, feeding it until the cabin glowed warm as sunrise. He checked the creature's breathing, adjusted the blanket, poured more water. It stirred once, opening its dark, heavy eyes. They met his tired ancient, grateful. Walter smiled faintly. "You're safe now." A sound rumbled deep in the creature's throat. Not a growl, not a word, something in between. A note of recognition. Then it drifted back to sleep. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the cabin, sealing them in a cocoon of silence. Walter didn't mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the storm. He sat beside the fire until dawn, watching the flames dance over the logs, listening to the breathing beside him. When the first light crept through the window, the creature was still asleep, but its chest rose and fell steadily. Walter reached over, gently tugging the blanket higher around its shoulders. He felt Rex press against his leg again, the old dog's warmth grounding him to this moment. He whispered softly, half to the creature, half to himself, "You're not alone anymore." The fire popped, sending sparks into the dim morning light. And in that small, fragile silence, something healed inside him, not just the creature's body, but a wound in his heart that had been frozen for 10 long years. Part 5. The Return. Spring came soft that year. The snow melted into streams that whispered through the roots of the cedars. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and for the first time in months, sunlight touched the cabin roof like a gentle hand. Walter Hensley stood outside with his axe resting against the porch rail. His hair, more white than gray, now caught the light. Behind him, the cabin smoked faintly from the morning fire. The world felt alive again. The forest, once frozen and still, was breathing. The young creature had stayed all through winter. It slept near the hearth, ate small meals, followed Walter quietly from room to room like a shadow that had finally found its shape. But lately, it had grown restless. It would stand by the window at night, looking toward the woods, listening. Sometimes it would let out a low hum, the same sound Walter had once mistaken for the wind. He knew what it meant. Home was calling. That morning, as he split the last of his logs, Rex began to growl again, not in warning but in recognition. The same sound he'd made the first night the creature came. Walter turned. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was another shape, taller, broader, wrapped in a coat of thick dark fur that shimmered under the sun. The air itself seemed to tighten around its presence. The adult Bigfoot stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on the cabin. Walter froze the axe, slipping slowly from his hands. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't move at all. He only felt his heart thudding deep and steady, not from fear, but from understanding. The young one had stepped out from the doorway, now blinking at the light. For a long moment the two creatures stared at each other, mother and child separated by a season of survival. Then, with a quiet sound almost too soft to hear, the child took a step forward. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The adult knelt, lowering itself until their eyes met. One large, furred hand reached out and rested gently on the young one's shoulder. A sound passed between them, a low, rhythmic murmur that carried both relief and reprimand, like a mother scolding softly through tears. Walter stood back, watching from the porch. His eyes burned his throat tight. This was the moment he had both hoped for and dreaded. The young one turned halfway, glancing at him over its shoulder. Their eyes met just as they had that morning by the foggy creek. Only now those eyes weren't afraid. They were full of light, full of understanding. Walter swallowed hard. He tried to smile. "Go on now," he said quietly. "You're home." The creature blinked once, long and slow, as if the forest itself had taught it to say thank you without words. Then it turned, pressed its small hand into the larger one of its mother, and together they stepped into the trees. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden slants, turning their fur into silhouettes of amber and shadow. For a moment, Walter thought he heard another sound, faint and melodic, like the echo of a voice carried on the wind. Not words, not language, just feeling. He stood there long after they were gone, his hand resting on the porch rail. Rex leaned against his leg, whimpering softly, as if mourning something he didn't understand. Walter looked toward the forest, eyes glistening. "Take care of each other," he whispered. The air stirred in reply, a breeze that rustled the leaves in a slow, gentle rhythm like breath. He knew they wouldn't come back. Not soon, maybe not ever. But that didn't matter. He'd seen enough to know that kindness had a way of echoing even through the wildest corners of the earth. The sun climbed higher, the fog dissolved, and for the first time since his wife's passing, Walter Hensley felt something pure and rare fill the hollow space inside him. Not joy, not sorrow, but peace. He turned back toward the cabin, the smell of cedar smoke following him, and whispered, "Thank you for finding me too." Behind him the forest swayed, a living thing breathing remembering. The years passed quietly. Seasons blurred into one another, and the cabin aged with its owner. Walter Hensley, now gray and bent, sat on his porch with Rex resting beside him, both slower, both content. The forest stretched before them, endless and calm, wrapped in the golden light of autumn. On the wooden steps lay a folded blanket, a bucket of fresh water, and an old oil lantern glowing softly against the dusk. Walter's voice, low, steady, filled with time, broke the silence. "Every fall, before the first frost, I leave a blanket, a bucket of water, and a light for a friend." The wind stirred, rustling through the cedar trees. Somewhere far off, a faint knock echoed once, then, twice, deep and distant, like the heartbeat of the woods. Walter smiled. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. "Welcome home," he whispered. The lantern flickered, the forest breathed, and the world felt whole again. Message. In the Wild West, kindness is the only fire that never dies. Bigfoot was never the monster, only the reflection of our own humanity. If this story touched your heart, leave a little fire emoji in the comments so we'll know the kindness in you is still burning. This is Rancher Wild West Stories, the only channel blending Western cinema legend and healing, where every lonely night in the West hides a story that might save a soul.